Hello, everyone. This is Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritual Inspire Show. And today, my guest is the amazing Dennis McKenna. I don't know if he needs any more introductions, but I will do it anyways. Dennis McKenna has conducted research in ethnopharmacology for over 40 years. He's a founding board member of the Heffter Research Institute and was a key investigator on the Hoasca Project, the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca. From 2000 to 2017, he taught courses on ethnopharmacology and plants in human affairs as an adjunct assistant professor in the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. Dennis is the founder of the McKenna Academy, an incubator that nourishes the emergence of this still embryonic global consciousness. He is the younger brother of Terence McKenna. Dennis authored or co-authored several books, among which are The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, The Invisible Landscape, Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching, and published in 1975 under pseudonyms, it's Psilocybin, Magic Mushrooms Grower's Guide. Dennis, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I will start with something which is, very close to your heart about ethnopharmacology. So tell us to understand, what does the jungle ethnopharmacology teaches us? What's so special about that?
Well, ethnopharmacology is kind of the scientific tool, that the scientific lens, if you will, that can be brought to the investigation of what you might call traditional pharmacopoeias, traditional medicine, although it's not limited to medicine. Ethnopharmacology actually has a rather tortured definition, but there are reasons for it. And there are as many definitions of ethnopharmacology probably as there are ethnopharmacologists. I happen to like mine. Mine says that ethnopharmacology is the interdisciplinary, by definition, inherently interdisciplinary scientific investigation of biologically active substances used or observed by humans in traditional societies. So it's a kind of a long definition, but it's important in the sense that it's not always about medicinal plants. It's not always about plants, right? Because biologically active substances can come from plants, fungi, animals, bacteria, whatever. And all of these different classes of organisms have uses in traditional societies. Sometimes they don't even know that that's what they're using, but they have them. It's interdisciplinary by definition, being a kind of combination of pharmacology and the ethno side of it meaning people. What do people do, within the area of pharmacology? But it's also important to define that it has to do with traditional societies. In other words, it's the study of traditional societies. And for example, something like arrow poisons or fish poisons or things like that are clearly within the scope of ethnopharmacology. So it's not confined to medicines. I mean, it often is, but not necessarily, because indigenous people are actually quite creative. They can recognize a plant for its toxicity and very likely find uses for it. I think the classic example is curare. And curare is not one thing. Curare is an arrow poison, as you know, but it's not one thing. There are many curares. They're very complex recipes. And, this is a reflection of the sort of ingenuity of indigenous people. So if we didn't restrict it to that, traditional societies or indigenous societies or folk knowledge, I guess you could say, then everything we do is ethnopharmacology, even pharmacology is ethnopharmacology, because it's a people and working in institutional frameworks and so on, but it's still interaction of people with biologically active substances. But that's too big an area so we cut it down by saying we're looking at traditional uses here. But the point is that it takes, it combines these two areas. So, indigenous practices and then pharmacology and all that implies, which overlaps with chemistry and clinical studies and that sort of thing. But that's the basic definition of it. Not so basic.
I once heard you talk about a plant called datura. Is that different than ayahuasca? Does it require a ceremony or can be taken a different way?
Datura is a member of the nightshade family, the Solanaceae. And some nightshades, like datura, like belladonna, and many of them are toxic species. They contain a class of alkaloids called tropane alkaloids. And datura species they're often used in sorcery and witchcraft in traditional societies, in part because they can induce a state of delirium and confusion. They're psychoactive. They are not psychedelic not in the pharmacological sense, but they are profoundly psychoactive. And I sometimes characterize them. They are true hallucinogens, but not psychedelics. And psychedelics are, you can have hallucinations on psychedelics, but not invariably. The term hallucinogen is a misnomer. It's actually better applied to something like datura because you have hallucinations and you can't tell whether they're real or not. When you have a hallucination on a psychedelic, you usually know that what you're seeing is not real. In the case of datura and these nightshades, you can't say that. If you were sitting across the table from me and we were having this conversation, you could look as solid as you do, and it could be a complete hallucination, and I wouldn't know it until you just sort of faded away into the ether, and then, oh, okay, that wasn't a real person I was talking to. That was my delusion. Datura is, and because it creates confusion and really disrupts your, ability to distinguish reality from not reality. It also makes you extremely suggestible, and it can be abused in that way, and that's why sorcerers like it. And because basically, if you can contrive to dose somebody with datura or any of these nightshades, then they become very compliant. Because they don't really know what they're doing. And there are all sorts of horror stories about datura being used this way. In South America, the corresponding genus is Brugmansia. These angel trumpet. They used to be classified datura, but then the name was changed officially to Brugmansia. But they have the same alkaloids, and they are used very much in South America the way that daturas might be used in the southwest of the U.S. In Navajo witchcraft, for example, is all about datura. In the European traditions, these nightshades, datura, henbane, belladonna, mandragora, all of these things are in the same family with similar alkaloid profiles. In South America, it's the Brugmansias. And they are incredibly beautiful trees. They have, these funnel-shaped flowers that, are pollinated by different groups of animals. Bats like to pollinate some of the daturas, and they put out a very, alluring fragrance. and they are used in ethnomedicine, in shamanic traditions in South America, either by themselves or sometimes they're added to ayahuasca. The local name for the common name for Brugmansia species are Toei is what it's called in South America. And the common name is like angel trumpet is the common name. They're grown everywhere in the tropics because they're ornamentals, but it's called Toei. And sometimes they put leaves of Toei to ayahuasca. And when that happens, it's a good sign that the person you're dealing with is a shady character in a certain way, that a brujo, as we call it. Because if you know how to make good ayahuasca, you don't need to put datura into it, and it shouldn't be in it, in my opinion, because of what it does to you, and so if the guy is, or if the person is putting datura Toei into ayahuasca, I think that's a good signal that you should get the hell out of there.
Yeah, it's important to select the environment you are going to have your experience in, and your journey. Yeah, that's very important. I know, Dennis, that through the Heffter Institute, you are involved in the psilocybin research. Do you expect this substance to be available as a treatment anytime soon?
Psilocybin?
Psilocybin, yes.
Yes. Well, it's you probably follow the science. It's already happening. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to see this occurring because I mean, I guess it is just the nature of capitalism to look around for opportunities to make money, and now all of a sudden, psilocybin and psychedelics in general are sexy. Everybody wants to get involved in many startup companies, and everybody's trying to. They have a different angle on it. Everything from making microdoses to establishing clinical trials and doing it. The science is there. And I think it's very promising. I think the integration of psychedelics into medicine is a very promising development. How is it going to go? That's the question. The devil's in the details. But the idea that, psychiatry as a profession has been, in some ways it's disappointing. In part, because it relies to such a great extent on essentially psychopharmaceuticals, these things like SSRIs and that sort of thing, which at the end of the day are not that effective. Most of the clinical psychotropics that you might receive as a patient, are ineffective or barely effective. They certainly don't get to the root of your problems. Psychedelics hold out the possibility that a person with depression or PTSD or addiction, all of these things that they have been suggested that they can treat, they actually afford an opportunity for people to get to the root of the problem and actually cure themselves rather than paper it over, which is what most of these other things do. They numb you to what's happening, but they don't fix the problem, and psychedelics could potentially actually resolve these things. So a person is, finally really cured of depression or cured of addiction. But they're also a different class of medicine in the sense that I sometimes say it's never going to be about take two and call me in the morning. They require a very intensive therapeutic environment. With psychedelics, we talk about set and setting. And those are two variables that are very important. You have to setting, you have to find an optimal setting for the experience to take place. And then the set is even more complex because the set is what you bring to the experience. And that essentially is not only your expectations and maybe your intentions, but what you are, everything you've learned, everything you bring to the table, that's the set. And so you get the interaction, of setting, which should be minimally intrusive, but it should also support the experience. I mean, so it's good to have a comfortable place, that maybe some place you can listen to music or look at art or have some kind of sensory stimulus if it's appropriate. You need that. Then you have the setting, which is which you can, and usually there is, at least in a clinical situation, there's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of discussion that goes on with the therapist before they ever take the medicine, and then they have the experience with the help of the clinician who, again, their job is to be as unobtrusive as possible, but there, to support the patient. And then after the session, there's a period of integration. And that's also very important, to make the most of the experience so that you can kind of integrate and interiorize the insights that you have so that it sticks, if there's a therapeutic effect, so that, you actually are able to integrate that and the effects are long lasting. And these medicines are remarkable that way, that 1 or 2 sessions with something like psilocybin can help people overcome problems that they've had for years, and not responded to therapy, not responded to anything. I mean, the evidence is clear with something, for example, like smoking. I mean, you wouldn't think that psychedelics would be that useful for quitting smoking, because tobacco is often integrated very much into shamanic practices. But work at Johns Hopkins has shown that psilocybin is extremely effective for helping long-term serious addicts to tobacco, 2 or 3 pack a day people that have done it all their lives, 2 or 3 sessions with the right preparation and everything. 80% of that group in the early studies that they did were able to basically stop smoking. And 6 months later, they were still tobacco free. And then a year later, they were still tobacco free. Always there's a few people that drop off, But in general, the therapeutic effect is robust and long lasting. So there's never been a class of medicines that has, they've been used in traditional context for forever. It requires a different approach to therapy if you're going to use psychedelics effectively. And basically the economic model around biomedicine right now, it's very difficult to support that, because a therapist has to tie up a lot of their time, and they're based on that. So, there's a need for pre-session integration, pre-session preparation, and then the session, which takes at least a day, and then post-session integration, which might go on for, there might be several post-session interviews, sessions with the therapist. So the economic model doesn't easily support psychedelic therapies, which is not a criticism of psychedelic therapy. I mean, it is more effective than anything that is available. It's a criticism of the way medicine is structured. It's far too driven by the economic factors, I think, and it has to change if psychedelics are going to be effectively used in clinical settings. And then the other side of it is, and maybe one reason it's been resisted for so long, because these are medicines that you take rarely and once or twice, or a few times to get the therapeutic effect. Big pharma doesn't like that. They want things you take every day for the rest of your life, hopefully 4 times a day, That's where the money is. I don't think there's money to be made in manufacturing psychedelics. In the pharma model, I think the revenue comes from the services that you provide, the clinical support. I think ideally these things are not used in hospitals or clinics. They should be used in therapeutic centers that look more like holistic wellness centers and that kind of thing. They would fit very well into that context. And that's I think that's the future of therapeutic use of psychedelics. Once these things are approved, I think you're going to see that model.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And correct me if I'm wrong, but psilocybin is the only psychedelic which doesn't require a specific, shamanic ceremony, a specific, jungle type of setup. Can be taken anywhere, even in a controlled environment, as you mentioned.
Yes, I mean, to some degree. I mean, I don't think any psychedelic can be used on its own, depending on the person that's using it, and their experience and so on. LSD can be used this way. Psilocybin can be used this way. MDMA can be used this way. Something like ayahuasca can be used that way, but generally we think of ayahuasca as being used in a group setting with a shaman or some kind of a ritual, some kind of a ritual around it. It does not have to be a traditional shamanic setting. I mean, it fits comfortably into that, but that it doesn't have to be that. And I know people, and I've known people who have, the conventional wisdom is that you must learn to use ayahuasca with a teacher. You have to apprentice yourself to a teacher to learn to use ayahuasca. But I know people that have taught themselves how to use it, and they're doing just fine. Ultimately, it's great to have a vessel. I sometimes tell people ayahuasca is a liquid. It's going to fill whatever vessel you provide for it. Whether that's a traditional shamanic ceremony or a new age neo-shamanic retreat center in Marin County or whatever it might be, it will fill the vessel. And it really doesn't matter that much what the ritual context is. It's just that there needs to be a ritual context to contain the experience. It makes it much better if there's some structure around it. But you have a wide latitude in how you choose to structure the experience. So ritual is important because you're putting people into a context where the point of what they're doing, the whole objective of what they're doing is to blow up temporarily. Well, blow up, that's a scary term, but temporarily disable the default mode network. And the default mode network is what we depend on to keep ourselves grounded in normal reality. Well, you're entering into the sessions with the objective of disrupting normal reality temporarily so that you can get some insights by stepping out of that reference frame. You can get insights into lots of things, but if it's a therapeutic session, you can get insights into what your problems are, depression or trauma or whatever it is you're there to explore. And of course, we talk about these disorders as though they were in boxes, and that's not really usually the way it works. They're overlapping. People are complex. So, if you have trauma, chances are you also have anxiety, and you may have addiction because you may turn to these other addictive drugs to deal with your insecurities and your fears and all that. So the treatment is complex, and but it's interesting. It's like psychiatry has traditionally relied on things like SSRIs, which serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, as antidepressants. But then they can also be used for anxiety, and they can be used for other things, and they tend to be overprescribed. As happens every time a new drug comes along, it's overprescribed. But in the case of psychedelics, if there were such a thing as what you might call a broad spectrum psychotherapeutic medicine, psychedelics would be that, because what happens is so dependent on these variables of set and setting, so depending on your expectations and your experience and everything else, they can be used to treat virtually anything. It depends on how you guide the experience. There was recently, there's an investigator at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who I've worked with on a couple of my ethnobotanical projects, but he is the director of the NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health Psychoactive Drug Screening Program. And it's basically investigational psychopharmacology. He has all of these different cell lines with all of these neurotransmitter receptors expressed in these, genetically engineered cell lines. They are the targets, and then he has automated systems so he can screen, thousands of compounds a day if they want to do that. He recently got a grant from DARPA, which is Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's a shadowy part of the Defense Department. They do all the cutting edge and semi-secret and probably fairly sinister stuff, And he got a $30 million grant from them just recently to design non-psychedelic psychedelics.
Wow.
And in other words, psychedelics that had the experience engineered out of it, but will do the same things that psychedelics do on the neurophysiological, pharmacological level. They'll do what psychedelics do, but you won't actually have an experience. And I told him this is a non-starter. I don't think you can. I don't think you can develop a psychedelic and eliminate the experience. The experience is what it's all about, because it puts you in this state, this disruption, this deliberate demolishing or disabling is a better word of this default mode network, because the default mode network is where it's a set of habits and behaviors and memories and expectations. It's what you rely about. It's kind of the cocoon we all wrap ourselves in order to be functional in the world, and a lot of what the default mode network does, it excludes things, it prevents too much information to getting in, because the brain constructs its own reality. And if it were overwhelmed by sensory data or whatever, it would just be confusing. So the default mode network is a way to get enough in to construct a plausible model of reality, but not so much that you're overwhelmed by it. And then if you take a psychedelic, you deliberately, temporarily disable this So that's what enables you to, that's where the therapeutic effect is. It's almost like returning to an embryonic state in a certain way, or maybe a stem cell is a better analogy. You break down this system, and it's like rebooting your computer. You know, when you restart the computer, a lot of things go away that get accumulated in the system, and it purges them out. So then the default mode network is very resilient. It will reconstruct itself most of the time, almost always. It will reconstruct itself, and your mind, your brain will run a little bit better. It's like adding STP into your gasoline. The engine will run smoother. So I think I think that's where the therapeutic effect is. And it happens on the psychological level, but also on I think the genetic and epigenetic level. You can actually modify gene expression and this sort of thing and develop new connections that persist beyond the psychedelic experience. So novel, essentially rewired, that modified this variable that we call neuroplasticity, which a few years ago it was thought that neurons could not reproduce. And now all that's gone out the window. Not only do they reproduce, and psychedelics sometimes stimulate that, but they also form new connections. It just makes sense that this would happen because they're complex systems interacting with the outside and the inside environment and responding accordingly. So,
yeah, Dr. Jody Spezza and Bruce Linton, they both talk about neuroplasticity. So in other words, there is light at the end of the tunnel and hope for those who need this type of help. It's very close to happen. That's good news.
Yeah, it is happening. But in order to see it, I mean, these things may be approved. I mean, they are already being approved, and it will be interesting to see how they get integrated into medicine. And I'm I'm all for that happening. My own bias is toward the plant medicines, or the fungal medicines, the natural medicines, because they're the ones that have been used traditionally. And in some ways, I think they come to us from a long historical and cultural tradition where indigenous people have lived with these plants for millennia. Sometimes they've learned how to use them. They've created, these very practical kinds of technologies for using them. And I think that psychiatry would do well to pay attention to that, and try and not necessarily, you can't really imitate them. We can't become indigenous people, but we can look at what goes on in these practices and try to integrate them with conventional psychotherapeutic practice, maybe come up with something that's superior to either one by itself. That's what I'd like to see. And then ultimately, I think, it's hard to reduce the psychedelics to, crystals and capsules, essentially. You can do it, they have the effect, but you lose the cultural associations. And often psychedelics are important in sort of waking people up to their relationship with nature. And so it's better if you're taking a natural psychedelic in a natural setting, maybe. You don't have to do it that way, but it would be optimal to do that. So what I would like to see in the future of psychedelics is that, in the first place, I'm really encouraged by a lot of these decriminalization movements that are going on. I think that should go forward. we could go on and on about, I mean, I personally feel that the very idea that you could criminalize a plant is absurd. You know, I mean, it's absurd. They just hands off, just leave them alone. You know, let people use them the way they want to, and so the you know, a consequence of this, once the decrim movement gets started, is that you could have these therapeutic centers in North America and Canada and the US. Maybe some of them would be managed by a Native American or First Nations people. That's one way you could do it. Or if the medicines are not prohibited and just not regulated, then these centers can operate in the open and with no shame, and every community could have a psychedelic therapy center, you know, which they may offer other things too, other types of healing modalities like yoga and body work and this sort of thing. But within that context, they could offer psychedelic therapy. And then if they form alliances with indigenous people, for example, in South America, that use this in the tradition, you know, they could share, or they could be the suppliers of these medicines to North America. And, you know, through legal channels, legal distribution channels, and so on. And that's ideally how I'd like to see it develop, because one thing that would do, you would empower the indigenous people to be still the guardians and the producers of these plants, the keepers of the knowledge, and essentially economic benefits for them to produce these things under you know, controlled conditions and produce the medicines, and reduce the ayahuasca tourism phenomenon, which is, I mean, I participate in it, so I'm guilty, you know, but and in some ways it's great. I mean, I think it's great, but I also see that it has some adverse cultural consequences. You know, it must be done carefully with great sensitivity, and that's not always the case. You know, and if people who want these experiences can get them closer to home, that's a good thing, probably.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And these centers to be run by indigenous people, it's amazing. And in fact, that's the word I was looking for, empowerment, to give them that, you know, sense of belonging again into their communities, and they can teach us about the knowledge they have and their customs, and that's amazing.
Yeah.
Once, or in fact multiple times, I heard you say that only an increased level of consciousness can save us as humanity. And this is something, you know, I totally agree. I wrote about this concept in all my books. So what do you think it will take for us to create that critical mass to take us to that next level of consciousness?
Well, I think there has to be a global shift. I think that it's happening. I think that this is one reason why people are reaching out to psychedelics and reaching out to these traditions, because you know, a couple of things drive it. One is simply that, you know, people crave meaningful experiences. And largely, they do not find it anymore in our institutionalized religions. You know, they're probably the last place that you should expect to have a genuine mystical experience. You know, a direct communication with the divine is not something they encourage. You know, this is something for the priests to do, and it's not for the individual. And so that's inherently threatening to these power structures. And that's what organized religions basically are. They're power structures that are not so much designed to provide spiritual fulfillment as to make sure that you don't think too much, you know, and that you accept whatever they're telling you is the truth, and stop asking so many questions. Well, psychedelics are the opposite of that. I often said, you don't have to have faith. In religions, you're expected to have faith. And to me, faith is accepting what somebody tells you without any evidence. It may well be true, but you accept it on faith and you don't question it. And psychedelics are the opposite of that. You don't have to have faith to benefit from a psychedelic. What you have to have is courage. Enough courage to actually sit down and take the cup or smoke the pipe or whatever it is, and then let it unfold, let it speak to you. You can expend a lot of effort trying to develop an optimal setting for it, and make sure the medicine is good quality and all that. But the rubber meets the road in the intense personal interaction between you and the medicine. Sometimes they call these things plant teachers. And I think that that's actually a fairly accurate characterization. And in a traditional context, there may be a shaman. There may be a shaman that's holding the space, as they say, or orchestrating the circumstances. But the good ones, the ones that know what they're doing, they know when to step out of the way. They know that the real therapy and the real experience happens between a person and the medicine. They're just there to facilitate that. Make sure that it's a safe environment. Make sure that they're there if the person becomes anxious or otherwise gets into some rough spots. But in general, their duty is to sit back and let it unfold, let it happen, and then be there to help people integrate after the session. A lot of times we say the real work begins after you go home, and that can go on for weeks, years, sometimes a lifetime. I mean, people do look back on some of their most profound psychedelic experiences as well. As you're probably familiar with the work that Roland Griffiths and his people did on psilocybin. And they don't talk about mystical experiences. Maybe that's a too highly charged word, but they talk about meaningful experiences, and many of their subjects said it was the most meaningful experience I ever had. That's a pretty amazing claim to make for a drug, that it can do that, and yet these things do, and it is, and the meaningfulness of the experience becomes a remembered experience, something that you can really cherish. I mean, it's become one of those things in your life that is a highlight. I mean, I remember, we all remember the highlights of our lives, I remember the first time I made love. I mean, that was a highlight, although it didn't really go that well. but it was the first time, and so it left an impression. And the psychedelics are in that category, among the few experiences that we may have in a lifetime that really have an impact on who we are.
Yes.
And yeah.
You took Brian Rose of London Rio down to Soltara in Costa Rica, and you shoot that movie Reconnect. Was that a way to familiarize people with ayahuasca and with the indigenous culture, or because it had a different purpose?
Was it a way to familiarize people with ayahuasca?
Yes, and with psychedelics in general.
Yeah, Soltara is a retreat center in Costa Rica that I go sometimes, and I get to go there. I'm the guest of honor. I provide some lectures, and so I get to come for free. And we were there, and then this gentleman from London, Brian Rose, I had been a couple times in the UK. I'd gone to his studio and done podcasts, and we talked about ayahuasca and so on. And I just felt that he really could benefit from it. But he was always not, just busy like everybody is. It's like, I got too much going on, man. I can't take time, And I just said, Brian, this is an excuse. You just need to get on a damn plane and get down there, which he did. And as you see in the movie, it's it was very very meaningful for him, and he was grateful that he did it. So that's the thing. You can't force people to do it, but you can encourage them. And usually they thank you afterwards, but it's such a personal thing that everybody has to come to it on their own terms. It's this dynamic interaction of the setting and the set, and every set is unique. We are each an individual, and there's no other entity in the universe exactly like us, so that's a really important component of this interaction. And then of course there is whatever the medicine is, and the dose. Those are also important variables.
Yes. One of your latest and dearest projects is the McKenna Academy. Please give us more details about it.
Yes. Yeah, the McKenna Academy is an idea I had probably because I spent a lot of time in academia. I taught ethnopharmacology and botanical medicines for about 20 years at the University of Minnesota. And it was a great experience, but I talked about ayahuasca and other psychedelics a lot. And they were tolerant of that, but I always felt like I was a bit marginalized. And it was in a division of the medical school there called, the Center for Spirituality and Healing. So it's not like, and it was the alternative medicine programs, and so it's not like they weren't tolerant of woo-woo ideas or unusual ideas. But I used to tell them, I teach the hardest science course in your curriculum, because I was talking about plants and chemistry and how they worked and all that. And other people are doing, yoga and mindfulness and energy medicine and all that stuff, which is fine. I don't put it down, but it's not exactly hard science. What I taught was the same kind of course that I would teach in a biology department. And that's how I viewed it, since my background is ethnopharmacology. When I moved to Canada, I long have wanted to create a nonprofit that would essentially be my own academy. You might say I was a failure as an academic. Even though I was 20 years teaching at the university, I was always adjunct. I didn't play the game of academia. I did not worry about tenure or anything like that. I worried a bit about grants, but I wasn't trying to get a grant every time. I stumbled into a couple that were interesting. But I wanted to create an academic institution where the focus is on learning and on natural philosophy. And natural philosophy is the precursor of science. It's what science used to be before it became quantitative and reductionist and only concerned with certain ways of knowing. There are other ways of knowing that are legitimate. And natural philosophy, science grew out of natural philosophy, and natural philosophy casts a much wider perspective. And as the name implies, it's essentially a way to understand ourselves, nature, and that relationship, our place in nature. And I wanted to model the McKenna Academy over on the mystery schools in the Mediterranean, of which Eleusis was probably the best well-known and the longest lived, in which psychedelics were part of the curriculum. Having these experiences, it was recognized that they have value. And within the context of Eleusis, I mean, that's what you went there for, among other things. There were other teachings and so on. But I felt that the time was right for a modern mystery school, 21st century mystery school, that would certainly respect science and include science, but have a broader mandate than just scientific investigation. And so I decided to found this academy. And why is that important? Well, in part because I'm passionate about this. I'm committed. People might say, yeah, you're also a tremendous egoist, right? Egotist, because you've named the academy after yourself. I'm really not. I'm all about collaboration. I'm all about working with people, the best minds I can find, to create incredible educational experiences, and I decided to call it the McKenna Academy because the name has a certain recognition. And people told me, if you're going to do this thing, step up and own it. Don't be ashamed of it. Put your name out there. So I'm doing that. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm having a good time. I'm attracting some just amazing talents, and brilliant minds. And in my experience, I'm kind of a generalist, but I know a little about a lot, but not so much a lot about some specialty, except certain specialties. But I like spending time with people who have expertise in different areas that may be fairly opaque to me, but I still find them interesting. And this academy is a place to bring people together to share their knowledge, and hopefully, those experiences will be transformative for people. And that doesn't always involve taking psychedelics, it could be, it often will. The academy, plant medicines, or plant teachers, as we might call them, are definitely central to what the academy is about. I sometimes say, it's the first psychedelic mystery school in 1500 years, and not all the faculty members are human. So
Right.
yeah.
And also I see it as your legacy, which is very important.
Yeah, maybe so.
I would like to get closer to the end of the interview with a question which I think is important. Why do you think that the society at large still disregards the indigenous wisdom? Is that a fair statement?
Well, I think yes. I think that society in general has tended to dismiss indigenous wisdom. That's been the usual way it's been. They dismiss indigenous wisdom along with the indigenous people and the knowledge that they have. And this is just arrogance. This is the arrogance of the European tradition, where the white colonialists tend to think that they're the superior civilization, and no other civilization could possibly have anything to offer. But in fact, that's not true. If you look at the New World at the time of Columbus and before that, they were very complex societies. They were every bit as sophisticated as anything in Europe. But Europe has this mindset that, they have to be the dominators, and they encounter these other societies, which have less of a mindset toward war and conflict. And so they were helpless in a certain way as these Western predatory civilizations came to, to take them over and basically disrupt them and just decimate them as they have. But they miss a lot. I mean, they miss that knowledge. Now we're in an existential situation where we need to learn from those traditions. We've forgotten how to live in harmony with nature. That is at the center of what's wrong with us, is that we have gotten out of sync with nature. We've become estranged from nature. And we have been poisoned by this Western mindset that nature exists to serve us. We're entitled to own it, exploit it, dominate it, and ultimately destroy it. And that's exactly what we're doing. And we're not, and the psychedelics can be a catalyst for waking us up to the fact that this is happening. What we have to do is understand that we do not control nature. Nature is running the show. By the very fact that it makes life sustainable on the earth, the plants are running the show through photosynthesis and all this, and we tend to think that, we're not apart. We tend to think of ourselves as apart from nature and superior to nature. And this has been encouraged really by the Abrahamic religions, which teach us that, our reward is in heaven, right? It's after you die that it really gets good. And so it's an incentive to devalue nature. And why should we expend effort to preserve nature? We're not, we're headed to the promised land or whatever. Well, this is a con game, actually. Maybe there is and maybe there isn't. My guess is there probably isn't, I mean, I don't know because I haven't died. But what we need to do is learn to value nature in this life, and we need to form alliances, or another word for that is symbiosis. So a lot of what the Academy is all about is symbiosis, emphasizing the idea that life succeeds when there's collaboration. The conventional view of evolution and all that is natural selection, competition, survival of the fittest and all that. That does go on. That's an element of evolution, but symbiosis and collaboration is much more important. And everywhere you look in nature, you see symbiosis. And we also engage in symbiosis, but not enough, and particularly with these plants. I mean, these plants and the traditions that the indigenous people have preserved for so long, we can learn a lot from these traditions. Western people, and especially scientists, tend to be fairly arrogant about what they think they know. And they know things for sure, but occasionally they need to step away from it and remember how little we know in terms of the overall picture of what's really going on. Psychedelics will forcibly remind you of that, how little we know. It's always good to keep that in mind. And science tends to be a profession that invites arrogance, and the temptation to say, we have this figured out. I'm sorry, we don't have it figured out. We have a very tiny slice of reality of the universe intensively studied, probably figured out, except that the inherent nature of science is it's always provisional. You never prove anything in science. You only can say consistent with, what we think, the data is consistent with what we think the phenomenon is. New data may come in the next day or next week or years from now that completely overturns the theory. That's one of the good things about science if it's properly, if it's properly practiced, which it often isn't, but it's self-correcting, in the sense that it's always undergoing revision. You build hypotheses and you test them against the available data. And if you're on it, and sometimes it fits. And then you can say, well, based on everything we know now, this looks like a pretty good understanding of the phenomenon. But you never say, we have proven this, then you cross over from science into dogma. And you cross over from science into religion, and science can get very culty in some ways when it's not immune from that. It's something that should be guarded against. We should always be testing our assumptions, and we should be humble. Humility is a good thing.
Yes, it's very important to be humble, especially in this environment. Dennis, I'm convinced that your words will resonate with the viewers of these channels. I invite all of them to go deeper inside, open their hearts to nature, as you said, to hug a tree. There's nothing wrong with hugging a tree and getting that energy back into our bodies. I really appreciate your time and being able to join me for this interview. Thank you very much, and we'll help you, gathering forces around the academy, even maybe raising funds for the blimp. You didn't mention that you are looking to purchase a blimp which will flow above the Amazon, from where you can, broadcast live various experiments or even ayahuasca ceremonies.
Okay, well, yes, thank you for inviting me. This was enjoyable for me. And tell people, I gave you the URL, you probably already have it. Stay tuned. We are, a lot of what the Academy is about and will be about is doing conferences and retreats and that sort of thing. Right now we can't do that because of COVID. So we're forced to develop more online things, which was always part of the plan. So we're just trying to develop an online presence, and we're giving different events. So people that are interested, they can keep in touch through the Academy, and we're trying to present everything from virtual conferences to podcasts to, individual one-on-one interviews and so on, always with the idea on topics that we think will be of interest to people, on nature, on the cosmos, on psychedelics, on consciousness, and, the big questions, right? So yeah.
Yes, life is a miracle, and we have to live it properly, embrace it with joy. Every single day we should embrace it with joy.
Yes. All right.
Thank you once again. And for everyone else, thank you for watching this interview. Share it and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget, you can support me by subscribing to the Patreon, to my Patreon account at patreon.com/Claudiu Murgan. Until next time, love and gratitude.